honestly, sincerely have those two different people, they both can't be true. So I think the basis for truth needs to be outside of personal experience, outside of culture. So to me, a key to understanding truth is the person of Jesus Christ. So I think we need to evaluate who he was and who he was in history. And I'll talk more about that later, and how you could evaluate the historical evidence. I like the story of if I asked you, where did you have lunch last Tuesday? And you said, McDonald's. And I said, prove it. And you say, okay, here's the receipt from McDonald's. And I say, how do I know that you ate at McDonald's? You could have got that receipt anywhere. I said, okay, I went with my roommate, and he'll testify that I had lunch at McDonald's. Well, your roommate's a good friend. He's willing to lie for you. I don't believe it. And I say, well, my roommate's girlfriend was there, and she hates me. And I can talk to her. And indeed, she does seem to hate you. And so that adds a little bit additional evidence to support that where you had McDonald's. And maybe there was a security camera, or maybe there, but I think you could establish a case for, yeah, I can believe with reasonable certainty that you had lunch, in fact, with great certainty, that you had lunch at McDonald's last Tuesday. But the evidence to support that is not scientific evidence. In other words, you can't produce an experiment to show that. So understanding events like who Jesus Christ was, I think you have to evaluate the evidence of the reliability of the New Testament scriptures and who he was and how it conforms to other events at the time. So again, I think looking at who he was, because if he was who he said he was, and I think he was, then he can reveal truth. So that was my question of how can humans have absolute truth? I think we can know it, but it's based on God, and there certainly are many things that are relative and societal constructs.
Dr. Luegenbiehl, along that same line, a lot of societies that are relative and subjective bodies, they've got a lot of common beliefs. They have a lot of common laws that would prevent, like murder. That's generally frowned upon in most societies. How would you respond to that? Like, does that signify that there is an absolute truth, or?
I assume now you've switched the topic from truth in general to this, what I was talking about, as normative truths, right? You shouldn't kill people, that kind of thing, right? And how do we develop this? Okay, but before I get there, okay, let me mention that none of my questions that you're going to pose to me, as far as I could tell, had God in them. Okay, so as Phil said, right? If there is no God, then there is no basis for absolute truth. I think I heard you say that, right? So it seems to me, if I'm going to carry on the discussion at the same level, all I would need to do would be to argue that there is no God. Okay, I don't think I want to do that here, but I do want to make the point, right, that if this would be the only source for absolute truth, then there's really going to be a problem in terms of the traditional foundation of evidence for any kind of demonstration of that claim. Okay, because I think it's beyond our means to argue for the existence of God on a scientific basis. Okay, but I'll back to your specific question. How do we come up with similar rules in different societies? First of all, we ought to recognize that there are many societies in the world that have quite different rules from ours, and often it's ignorance that prevents us from being aware of that. Okay, and one of the foundations of modern anthropology is the fact that we actually went out there and looked at what people believed. Famous example of that, of course, the pioneering work of Ruth Benedict. Some of you may have studied her in anthropology. Okay, and so to make this claim about similarity, it oftentimes just represents kind of a narrow perspective that we approach the world with. Okay, and in fact, Westerners historically have encountered people of different beliefs, which have been part of the movement to reform these so-called savages, as we used to call them. Okay, so there's plenty of evidence that there are different moral beliefs in the world, but there is some amount of similarity as well. I will grant that. So your question is really how do we account for the similarity? And that question to me has a very simple answer. Human beings generally want to get along with each other, and there are certain rules that are appropriate to follow if you want to get along with each other. It doesn't take a whole lot of experience to figure that out, okay? If I go around spitting at people, they're not going to get along with each other. We're not going to get along with each other. That's going to teach me fairly rapidly that it's not a good idea for me to spit at people, okay? If we go around killing each other, pretty soon we're going to find out none of us are going to be left. Okay, so societies institute rules against people killing each other on a random basis. I don't quite frankly need revelation for me to figure this out. Okay, some of you probably had some bad experiences in terms of these kinds of things, right? Where you've behaved in inappropriate ways, and people have let you know that these are inappropriate. They didn't even need to call on some kind of rule book. Okay, they were pretty much able to figure this out for themselves, and that works itself out historically. Dr. Cornwell, I'm sure, teaches his children, his parents taught him, and so on down, and these things become refined over the generations. We hopefully, at least I'm hoping, we get better and better at this, although sometimes I really wonder. Okay.
Thank you. Dr. Cornwell, would you say that we're able to interact with other cultures and nations with opposing truths from our own without having a supremacist or some sort of imperialist attitude about it? If we believe that we know the absolute truth and they have something different, that would be wrong?
Yes. I do believe we can do that. One thing Heinz said, though, that his questions don't address God and mine don't specifically address God, but I'm not going to shy away from the fact that that is the foundation of my argument. And I think you have to discuss the existence of God. And I don't want it to become a debate over the existence of God. But if there is no God, then I would be left with the conclusion that everything is relative. There is no basis for coming up with, to me, any sort of ethical or reasonable belief in knowledge. So I'm going to keep saying God over and over, Heinz. So as far as the imperialistic attitude and confronting other cultures, I think, and I'm the first to admit that this has not always been done, it's not always true, and I think it's wrong, because many things are purely culture. In other words, you have to be careful in deciding what is absolute truth. And I think, for example, spitting on someone, or spitting on the ground may be considered inappropriate here. In China, it may be perfectly fine to spit on the ground. That would be a cultural thing. Which side of the road to drive on doesn't really matter. Although, when I lived in Australia, it was really, really stressful driving on the other side. And personally, I think it's wrong. But I wouldn't state that as an absolute truth. I would say that's a relative truth. So again, the problem with letting culture or society decide what is wrong, I don't think there's anything that prevents the society from deciding, and maybe people want to get along, but that we should kill Jews, or we should kill babies, or some culture could decide torturing babies for fun is okay. And I would say, I think there are not a lot of things that are absolute truths. God is one of them, things that are based on his character. But torturing babies for fun seems to be pretty close to what I would call an absolute truth. And it's not because no